Okay, so now let's do some actual sewing. I was going to take you through the sewing process for each of the different panty patterns, but actually I quickly found that there was a pattern in the way that these were constructed. So there are two main construction methods for putting together most of the pairs of panties, and then there is one exception with the rosy lady shorts. So I'll go through those pretty quickly and then just let you know which patterns require which construction method. And just for the sake of ease with telling the difference between these two methods, I'll call it the 3-piece and the 4-piece method. So first up with the 3-piece method, I've got the Make Bra Hipster panties. And what I mean with 3-piece and 4-piece is the number of pieces of fabric that we cut out. So for this 3-piece pattern, I've got the Make Bra Hipsters. I chose this one because it gives a very clear idea of the front and back side of the fabric. And so this is the back. Oh no, sorry, that's the front. This is the back. And then we've got a single lining, gusset, crotch piece, whatever you want to call it. So starting with the lining piece, this bigger part back here, this is the seam that we're actually going to sew, and this is right side facing up. And I'm going to place the back piece with that same seam and line that up on top. And this is also right side up. And then on top of that, I'm going to put the right side down of the front piece. And so we've got the 3 pieces all kind of sandwiched together, lining up that seam. And so it's kind of hard to see with the lining piece, but it's right side up, and then wrong side up. And I'm just going to pin those together. And then you'll sew that with the specified seam allowance. You have to check each pattern. Usually it's around 1/4 of an inch or maybe 1/2 centimeter. It really depends on how the pattern was drafted. So you sew that up. It might ask you to grade it or finish it or overlock it in some way. But basically you're just stitching up that seam, sandwiching the back piece between the lining and the front piece, and you'll end up with one enclosed seam, and you'll bring the gusset forward like that, and now you can see how it kind of lines up with the front piece. And then the next construction method that I'll go over, I'm going to be using the Megan Nielsen Acacia panties to demonstrate. And I'm calling it the 4-piece method just because we cut out 4 pieces instead of 3. So we've still got the front and the back, that's the same, but we've also got 2 lining pieces instead of just 1. So that means one of these will be visible from the outside. So rather than kind of overlapping with the front piece, it forms its own separate thing. And so you'll also have 2 seams to sew instead of just 1. But the construction method is very similar, and we're actually going to follow the 3-piece method to start out with. So we've got our lining piece, so this is right side up. I've added just little pieces of washi tape so that we can tell which side is right and wrong side. So we've got the right side up, and then for that back seam on this pattern there are notches so you can tell which seams need to line up. I'm also going to do right side up, and then instead of connecting it with the front piece, we're going to connect it with the other lining piece, and for that right side goes down. And so I'm just going to line up all of those little notches there and pin those in place. And then you would sew this seam again according to the seam allowance required for the pattern, and then if there's anything like grading or overlocking or finishing in any ways, you can do that here as well. And then the next difference with the 4-piece construction method is that we now have to sew the front piece onto the lining pieces as well. And so for that, I'm going to just move this top piece out of the way and kind of roll the back piece out of the way. And just the same as with that back piece, so we're going to have the right side facing up. So I've got my washi tape on the back there, and I'm just going to kind of stuff that into the lining sandwich there. And I'll overlap this piece down there. And you kind of end up with this little like burrito thing here. And so I'm going to pin that in place. And you would sew the seam in the same way. So whatever the seam allowance is, and then if any grading or finishing is necessary, you would do that here as well. And sometimes I also see patterns call for kind of doing an extra bit of stitches on the edges of the seams right here, just so you can be sure that it's extra secure. And then the last one that I'll talk about is how to construct the lady shorts from Cloth Habit, because this is the only one that was kind of different from the other patterns. So what's interesting about this one, we cut out two pieces that are exactly the same pattern piece but just mirrored, and then a lining piece of course. And this pattern has no side seams, so we're actually putting a seam on the front and back rather than at the sides. And so for that we're going to connect so according to instructions, we sew the back seam first and then the front seam. You're going to put them on top of each other, so just sewing them right sides together. Okay, and so with the specified seam allowance, we will sew one seam and then we'll sew the other one. And then what you'll end up with is a kind of big circle. And then we're going to deal with these seams in the middle, and this is going to be the crotch seam. So let's sew this up first. And so here's what the hipsters look like after I've sewn that back seam here. So I just used my overlocker. You can just fold up the gusset piece, and so this is the inside of the panties, and you can see how it just fits in nicely, overlapping that part of the front piece. And what I like to do is leave it open like this, and then you can very easily finish the leg holes in just one pass. So if you're going to be using narrow lace, fold over elastic, picot elastic, you can kind of very easily do it in just one pass, and then you don't have to worry about connecting each edge or trying to figure out how to make it into a circle that will fit kind of the leg hole that you need. I will say it will be good to check the instructions from the pattern designer. Some of them will give you exact measurements for the elastic that you need, and some of them might tell you to either cut it smaller than the measurement of the leg hole so that you can give it some tension and stretch it out, which will mean that you'll get a tighter fit around the leg hole. Or some of them might say don't put any tension on it and only sew it kind of flat and easy, which means that they've created the leg hole in such a way that it's not supposed to be like super squeezed, or maybe it's drafted that way already with enough negative ease that you don't need to add further tension to the elastic. Hopefully that makes sense. So anyway, next step, finish the leg holes. Just be sure that when you're kind of passing over this part that you are kind of securing the lining piece to the front piece. So if it's with fold over elastic or picot, just make sure that you are kind of catching all the layers here. Some pattern designers might suggest that you baste the lining to the front piece. I'm lazy, so I usually don't. Sometimes I'll use pins or maybe even a bit of fabric glue, like kind of the stuff that washes away pretty easily. But usually I just will kind of line it up and, you know, hope that my stitching is good. So you finish the leg holes, and then once you've done that, you just have to flip it over. So right sides together, we know how that goes. Match up the side seams. So, you know, pin those together, and then you can finish the waist. And there's also a couple ways that you could do this. You can either sew both side seams together, so then you do end up with that circle, or I've seen some designers suggest that you sew up one side seam, and then you have, again, one nice straight line that you can sew the finishing elastic onto, and then you can just sew up the other side seam, and that will easily connect the elastic together. Then the only thing is you kind of get a bit of bulk with the elastic depending on what kind of elastic you're using. So it's really just kind of about your personal preference and how you like to finish the elastic. And so this is what it looks like after I've sewn those two seams. So again, I've just used my overlocker here, got those two seams in there, and you have this little burrito, so I'm just gonna unfold it so you can see what it looks like. So now I have the lining piece is in there, the seams are nicely enclosed, and yeah, so again we have this kind of one big piece, and you can finish the leg holes in the same way, so kind of depending on your elastic finish. Then once you've done that, you can flip it over, right sides together, and then either sew up both side seams so that you can finish the waist, or you can sew up one side seam, finish the waist in one long pass, and then sew up the other side seam. And then that's it. So I've sewed up the two seams for the lady shorts, and now we've got kind of this loop of fabric here, and we still need to attach the lining piece. Super little piece here. And now this is gonna be similar to the 3-piece construction method that I showed earlier. It's just a little bit different because the front and back pieces are essentially just shaped differently. So we have one seam here, and we've got one seam here. So this is the right side, and this has a notch in it, so that's going to be the seam that we're actually sewing. So I've got right side up, and then kind of bringing it all over. Gonna put the right side down of the front side. And that'll be nice because then I can catch the tails of my serger threads here, and that'll keep it, you know, extra secured there. Okay, so I sewed up that crotch seam for the lady shorts. So you can see that here. And now, since this doesn't have any side seams, now you can kind of see it's mostly finished. The interior lining piece just kind of folds up, just like we saw with the other 3-piece panty patterns. And so now you're ready to finish the leg holes. So for this pattern it calls for narrow lace trim, which I do not have any in my stash at the moment, so I'll probably do either foldover elastic or picot elastic. And this one you don't get the same benefit as the other patterns where they do have a side seam, so you do have to sew it in the round, and then as well with the waist. But it's also just kind of a different order of construction. Like with all the panty patterns, this is the shape that you're going to end up with. It's just kind of where the seam exists. So now let me get started on finishing all the edges, and then we'll see what we get. Okay, so the next step in sewing all of these panties is going to be pairing the actual fabric with the elastics that I'm going to be using. So you might be able to see a small part of my very disorganized large stash of lingerie elastics. I've grabbed a bunch of different picot edge elastics, so that means that it's got a plush side, and then on the top edge there's a decorative edge. And I've also got a selection of foldover elastics. Most of them are going to be shiny on one side and matte on the other. There's a fold line in the center of it. And so this can be useful. You won't end up losing any seam allowance if you're using foldover elastic. If you happen to be at a stage where you can try on the panties already, just to see how they fit, you can get an idea of where the cut will end up on your body, so like the leg holes and the waist. And the foldover elastic is going to retain that same shape because it's not going to require you to fold away any of the seam allowance like you would get with a picot elastic. A couple of the patterns did specify that you can use a narrow lace trim, and so what they mean by that, let me find, for example, the Celeste Bikini pattern was one of them, and what that means is that you would take your lace and just kind of lay it on top and sew that along the edge, and then in some cases you can even cut away the fabric underneath of it. And also, like the foldover elastic, you don't end up losing any of the fabric or the seam allowance, but I just don't happen to have any around. So for the patterns that call for a narrow lace edge finish, I'm just going to use fold over elastic. And so next I'm going to pair my fabrics with my elastics. Celeste, got a bunch of kind of spare pieces of black fold over elastics. So Zoe knickers, that also calls for fold over elastic. So for that one I will use black. Make Bra Hipsters, also fold over elastic. For that one I'll use white. Acacia panties, fold over elastic or picot or 1/4 inch elastic. I've got this gray color, use that. Noel thong by Madeline, picot. I don't have any dark gray picot, so I'm going to use this black one. Okay, so the regular high-waisted Madeline ones are also using picot. So I've got more black picot. Stevie knickers, picot finish. It doesn't look like it will be enough. I wonder if this will be enough. We'll go kind of crazy and do purple for these. Maxine panties, fold over or picot. So I'm gonna do, I don't have any red fabric, but I have a ton of red elastic. I'm gonna use this one, just because I don't know what else I would use it with. Be Bashful picot finish. So I've also got another gray one. Lady shorts from Cloth Habit. So these call for the narrow lace finish, and so I will use fold over elastic. And for that I've got this nice matte black, and that should be it. Still have a ton of elastic though. Having had a couple days to rethink my style of adding the fold over elastic and kind of finishing the waistline and the leg holes, having this little guy in here is kind of bugging me, which really makes me think that even though you might have a bit more trouble putting on the elastic in the round, it might still be worth it because then you get a smooth interior. So I think what I'll try for the next pair is that I will sew up the side seams first, and that will also allow me to try them on and make sure they're not too big, because then I can still make any alterations to the side seams if necessary, and then I'll just go ahead and attach the elastic in the round. Hopefully that would be kind of a more convenient way to get a nice finish on the inside, because just at this stage now I'm finding that I have no idea how the fit is going to be, even though the panties are completely done. So if I sew up the side seams before finishing the leg holes in the waistline, then I could probably get a better idea of any alterations I need to make. Okay, so with my little revelation about how I think I'd prefer to sew up all the side seams first, I've also decided I'd rather do that on my overlocker. And so now I'm here at the machine and I'm just going to quickly zhuzh up all the side seams and then carry on. So let's get started. Looking good. Okay, so after I made a big fuss about how easy it would be to apply the elastic to the panties without sewing the side seams, I've gone ahead and sewn all of the side seams in the interest of having a better fit on the end result, which really is the most important thing. So now I'm going to talk about how to apply the various elastics in the round instead of flat. These are the lady shorts by Cloth Habit. This is going to be a fold over elastic. This one I'm going to apply it in 2 passes because that will give me a smoother finish in the end. So to start with applying the fold over elastic in the round in 2 passes, I've got the right side facing up and then I've got the wrong side of the elastic facing up. And I'm going to align the edge of the fabric with that middle line in the fold over elastic. And I'm not going to use any pins, which maybe I will end up regretting, but I just don't feel like using them. Make sure that your gusset, so if you're using a pattern that has a gusset piece that just hangs out and needs to overlap inside the panties, make sure that you're kind of aligning that correctly. Otherwise, you can also use a basting stitch or pins. So I'm going to set my machine to my preferred zigzag, which is a 3.5 width and 3 length. I found that it gives a good stretch. And then I'm going to put a little bit of tension on the elastic as I'm sewing, but not too much. I have already tried these on and they fit pretty well. I could just use a little bit more tension in the leg holes to really kind of, you know, have a good fit. So the foldover elastic is underneath of the panties themselves, and I'm aligning the edge of the fabric with that kind of halfway point in the fold over the elastic. Let me just drop my needle in. A quick little back stitch. I'm also getting the tails out of the way from where I serged that crotch seam, and put a little bit of tension on the elastic without stretching out the panty material. Oh my goodness, okay. The end of this is in sight. Like, this fabric doesn't want to be next to the elastic. Okay, and now that I'm right at the edge of where I started, I'm just overlapping them slightly, and I'm going to backstitch where they overlap. And so I'm not doing any sort of like folding or any other little seam. I'm just kind of putting one on top of the other and continuing to sew. Okay. And the reason I did that is because I don't actually know how much elastic I wanted to have. Like, I wanted to give it a good amount of tension because when I tried these on, the leg holes were a bit loose, so I figured the elastic would really help to squeeze it together. And not really knowing how much elastic I wanted to use, I didn't want to cut a certain length and sew together the loop before I actually attached it to the leg hole. So this gives me a bit more freedom to kind of stretch it as I'm going along. Trim these. And then right where I overlap them, not sure if you'll be able to see, but I'm just gonna snip it there. And so I've got that whole finished piece now. But now that's only one pass, so we do have to go back and do the second pass. And I'm just gonna quickly kind of take a look around. If you find that you have a lot of fabric that's kind of crossing that middle line in the fold over elastic, then just go in with, you know, some fabric scissors, or I use my duckbill scissors to trim away any excess that you find, because that's just going to create a lot of bulk. So I can see, for instance, where the serge seam was for the crotch seam, there's kind of a lot of bulk there, so I'm going to flip around my scissors and use them the correct way and just give that a little snip. And now I'm going to do the second pass, which should be a lot more smooth since this slippery fabric is already stitched down, and just kind of top stitch it on with the same zigzag stitch. And I use my seam ripper sometimes just to kind of guide the elastic into the position that I want it to be in. Alright, and now that I've finished, you can see the elastic is a little bit wavy. I find that this really happens no matter how careful I try to be with not stretching it out while I'm sewing. I mean, obviously I'm sewing it with a bit of tension, so it is stretching out anyway. But I find that if I just kind of hit it with a bit of steam from my iron, not too close because you don't want to melt it, that usually helps to straighten it out, you know, tighten it back up again. And I should mention, applying the elastic is probably the toughest part about making panties. I mean, it's easy enough to just sew a couple seams, you know, side seams, crotch seams, etc. I mean, it takes hardly any fabric, so the cutting isn't that difficult. But applying the elastic in a nice way can take a bit of practice and a bit, you know, a couple passes. You know, I just want to give you some encouragement. Keep going! The end result is so nice. The elastic really is the toughest part, but then you're done! So, you can do it. And so similarly with the panties that I'm finishing with picot elastic, when I'm sewing it in the round, I'm not going to create the loop to start out with. I'm just going to kind of apply it in one single pass, and then when I get around the whole thing, I'll just slightly overlap it where I started. So I'm just going to trim it up a little bit so that I have a nice kind of continuous edge without any bumps. You want to make sure that the decorative edge is facing in, and you're going to sew it on the right side of the panties first. So just to try to visualize how I'm applying it. So you can see the decorative edge is facing on the in, and we're going to sew it on in one pass, and then maybe trim the edge on the other side, and then I'll flip it over so that you can still see that decorative edge on the other side and sew it on in a second pass. I am applying a bit of tension as I'm sewing on this elastic, so I'm just kind of pulling gently on the elastic, not pulling on the fabric itself because I don't want to stretch that out. Okay, and I've just overlapped the two edges. I wasn't quite so neat as I should have been. I will trim those back, and I will chop that off. And now I'll just go around quickly with my duck-billed scissors to cut off any excess fabric, so then there's less bulk. I will turn it over and do the second pass. Alright, so now I'm just gonna do the second pass. And remember, when you do the second pass, you are not gonna be putting any tension on the elastic or the fabric. Trying to be very gentle so that I can ease it through over this side seam, which is a bit bulkier, without stretching the fabric. And if you're overstretching the elastic or the fabric at this point, like you're kind of sewing it in that stretched state. I think if I was really concerned about how this would look in the end, I would have matched my thread to the dark gray fabric, but the black is close enough, so I will deal. I think if I do this again, which I will because I still have two other edges to finish, I want to make sure that I'm stitching more closely to the decorative edge on the first pass, and that means that when I fold it over, I'll have it really kind of flush right up against it. You can see it kind of, it's mostly even. There are a couple spots where I got too close to the decorative edge and it kind of disappears. I think ideally I would like something like that for the entirety of the leg hole, but I've got 2 more to go.